Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Coffee and Open Source. I hope we're going to have a great conversation today. I have a real awesome guest. We're going to talk about all sorts of fun things. I got my coffee ready, so let's go. Today, my guest is Jeff Strauss. Say hello, Jeff.
Hello, good morning. I have my coffee as well. Cup three, I think.
All right, so we were talking before, and before we get into the whole open source conversation, there's some stuff that happened last night. We want to talk about it. So last night there was a baseball game,
There was.
in a weird year, right? Um, the Dodgers won the World Series, so congrats to fans of the Los Angeles Dodgers. I made a comment right before we started that I hate the Dodgers. I don't hate the Dodgers, but I'm just going to give my opinion of the Dodgers, and then Jeff and I are going to have a conversation about baseball before we talk about open source. Um, so I remember. So I'm a Mariners fan. So in the Mariners are obviously in the AL. Well, I guess they're like double A at this point, um, but they're in the AL. So when you're in the American League, you're supposed to hate the Yankees, right? Like that's the job. You hate the Yankees, unless you live in New York and then you like the Yankees. My opinion of the Yankees was very for a long amount of times they were just buy players and they would spend tons of money and they would do all sorts of ridiculous stuff to win right now, and their salary cap was absurd. And when I look at the Dodgers now, I see the Dodgers as kind of like the new Yankees. I see them as a team that they get players and it's never like building upon young talent, right? I mean, yes, they have some young talent right now, but look, like a lot of the players that are on their team, like Mookie Betts, for instance, right? Like,
Sure.
anyway, that's my opinion. I don't hate the Dodgers. Congratulations to me. Um, Scott Addy says talk about the Cubs. Like, did the Cubs
No,
even play baseball this year?
we're not
Um,
talking about the Cubs. Like seriously, Scott, I
uh,
love you. We're not talking about the Cubs. See, I can talk about the Dodgers because, like I told Isaac, I don't. He's like, "Why do you love the Dodgers?" I don't love the Dodgers. I just don't hate them.
sure.
The Cubs. I mean, I'm from St. Louis.
I mean, like, isn't
I
that just
roll.
a like
Scott says I roll.
at that point, isn't it just a beer conversation, right?
I think
Like,
so.
do you like, do you like Bush? Do you like, I don't even know what Cubs fans drink. I don't know. Banquet? I don't know. Like, what's the, I know the big beer argument is the Brewers, right? Because Miller
Right.
but don't the Cubs have like some beer thing? I feel like when I went to, the last time I was at Wrigley, like across the street, there's like a Bush sign. It's like, beat the Cubs or something like that.
But keep in mind that like AB hasn't been a St. Louis owned company in quite a while either. Right. Like
Yeah.
Bush and Budweiser and all are still very popular around St. Louis, but they were bought by InBev
Mm.
10 years ago.
Yeah,
So
no. So our friend Scott says the 312 from Goose Island. So Goose Island is very good,
good
but
beer.
I'm a fan of their Green Line Pale Ale. That's me personally. I prefer a pale ale or a pilsner for my beverage. I know like which bothers all of my friends around here because they all drink what quadruple IPAs, which I just don't do. Um, but yeah. Anyway,
I
Goose Island. Shout out to them. Great brewery in
Isn't Goose
Chicago.
Island also an InBev owned beer now?
Probably. I mean, there's like two. There's like two
There's
like
two
the com-
breweries, right?
Well, no, but they're not even breweries. They're like equity firms, right? like they don't even like they just buy breweries. Like they don't do anything other than buy breweries, which bummed me out because I'm a huge fan of Rolling Rock. I love Rolling Rock,
Yeah.
and when Rolling Rock was bought, I was like, oh, that's a bummer, um, because even though things don't really change from like the consumer's perspective, the beer usually stays the same, or the beverage stays the same, but you're knowing that you're not just like driving local economy anymore. You're driving like some
Yeah.
like oil baron in like Austria with a mustache to get money, right? I mean that's a terrible stereotype, but that's just kind of where I'm at. So
You're not totally wrong. I mean, I don't know about the oil baron with the mustache, but I mean, I'm not a huge fan of mass produced beers in general. I never have been. And I mean, some of them are okay, but like I'm not a Bush Bud.
Yeah.
Michelob kind of guy,
Hmm.
but I used to drink a decent amount of it when I was a little younger, when AB was a local company, largely because not only were they local for the local economy and employing local people, because they've always had breweries all over the world, but the family invested a lot of money back into the St. Louis area.
Yeah.
And
As you do when you're like the biggest employer in the entire area, right?
right,
Yeah.
right. They invested money in culture and the arts and in schools and in all these other things. And AB, InBev, whatever they're called, I mean, they don't. And why would they? They're based in Belgium, and they,
Yeah.
there's no reason for them to do that. But because of that, I don't feel, you're right, I don't feel compelled to I'm just
Yeah.
watching Scott still talk about beer.
I mean,
IPAs are dirt flavored water
so
or
we
top
can.
oil
So
of beer.
I should just change this chat to just beer and open source instead of the coffee thing.
I
Um.
mean, you probably don't want to host it at 9 a.m. Pacific.
Well, it's
It
five
is.
o'clock.
These are COVID days, so
5 o'clock somewhere, right?
right. That's right.
Um. I mean, and we could sprinkle in all sorts of fun beer references. But I would like to talk a little bit about the goal of this, whatever you
Let's
want
do
to
that.
call it, stream, video, podcast, whatever, right? Um, Unexpected Error says 5 o'clock in Belgium. Problem solved. All right. Well, I'm gonna go downstairs. I'll be right back. No. Um, anyway, so we're here to talk about open source. And Jeff, one of the things that I really love to talk about with folks is kind of how they got started in the open source community, right? Whether you're a developer or you start going to events or you just like hanging out with fellow nerds, right? So like, do you remember the first time that you came across a scenario where like, hey, this is not something that people make a ton of money on and they're doing it for fun?
With the open source side of things,
Just in
yeah,
general, right? It doesn't need to
yeah.
be
Well,
traditionally open source.
yeah. My on the developer community generally, yeah. I mean, my path and story is kind of interesting, right? Because
Hmm.
as you know, I was a career changer, which more and more people in our industry are.
Yep.
Um, and I got involved largely because of events. Like the events came first for me in a way. I was transitioning into the tech software industry. Met a couple of local people here in St. Louis, where I live, who were at the time heavily involved in the St. Louis .NET user group, and we're starting off a conference. They were about 1 year into starting off an event. This is 12, 13 years ago, uh, called the St. Louis Day of .NET at the time, which eventually became St. Louis Days of .NET, and then sort of tried to branch beyond strictly Microsoft technologies and became
Yeah.
DevUp.
Hmm.
Still exists today. And I got involved with them largely because of my prior career. Like you know this. I'm an attorney, right? I don't
Hmm.
practice law. I haven't in a long time, but I got involved in the community because they were trying to start these events off, and they had a lot of questions about how to effectively raise and handle their money, how to think about taxes, how to think
Yeah.
about liability and corporate entities and things like that to start off an event.
Yep.
And so my path to getting involved was not so much because I was already a developer out there doing, I mean, I was already transitioning into this industry and this career, but
Yeah.
it was more because through a couple of connections, I met these folks and they invited me to join and come to the meetup, which I did. I met some people. I thought it was kind of fun. It was neat to see, fellow nerds wanting to hang out, talk about code
Yep.
on some of their own time to really improve and better themselves and better their community. But then it was appealing to me the idea of doing that on a larger scale, putting on larger events and educating in a whole region, a whole city, and industry, whatnot. And so I got involved through that. The open source side of things for me is also actually, strangely enough, tied to my background because for years, I mean, I give talks on business, and I give talks on leadership, and I give
Hmm.
talks on technology, cloud, and JavaScript and
Yep.
.NET stuff. But the talk I've given more than any other talk that I still give today at events and meetups is about open source
Yeah.
from the legal side of things, around licensing and what it means if you're in an enterprise. It used to be, back in the day, that it was at least semi-reasonable for a large organization to say that we generally avoid open source, but that's not really feasible today. I mean,
Yeah.
.NET Core is open source, JavaScript, it's hard, or I would argue silly, to build software without using open source
Oh,
now.
of course. Yeah.
Enterprises are still very immature in their models about how to deal with it and understanding what that even means. Um, so I got involved because I wanted to give an opportunity both at the business level and the individual level to sort of, I don't know, let people understand how they can get involved and what it means, how they can do so in a way that is both fulfilling and reasonably safe for their, you know, for their organizations or for themselves. So my path to it was kind of interesting, right? It was different from maybe the typical developer who sort of saw a thing on GitHub and said, maybe I should try this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I think, one of the things that's very interesting about your career is, like, so you started out in, I guess, the legal side of things, right? So I had a guest a couple of weeks ago, Hayden Barnes. I don't know if you know Hayden.
Mm-mm.
But so he is he works at Canonical, company that owns Ubuntu. He's an architect now, but he was a lawyer as well before. And I just find it very interesting that I've interviewed now two lawyers who now are developers. I think, maybe it's just because the law isn't interesting. Personally, like, I jokingly say that my favorite class in college was actually business law for whatever reason. I have no idea why. I still have the book somewhere, which is terrifying because it was a long time ago. But I think, one thing that I love that full disclosure, I've seen your talk, right?
Mhm.
The open source talk. And
Mhm.
one thing that I really love about it is that it hits on a lot of points that people just don't think about,
Right.
right? Like, if you're a software developer, and like now, like, maybe not as much 5 years ago, but especially now, like, GitHub is basically like the first place you go to look for things, right? Like,
Sure.
it's like Stack Overflow and GitHub, right? If you know how to effectively use both of those platforms, you could be a fairly successful developer, in my opinion, right? Like, problem solving skills and the ability to find things when you need to, right? And I would be very curious to know. I'm guessing GitHub probably has some metrics on it. How often the license file for a repo is actually opened? Because that would be something I'd be very interested to know about, right? Because you go to a repo, if the repo even has a license, like, a lot of repos don't even have
Well, they
licenses.
try when you build a new repo today, they try to guide you through that and
Yeah,
try to encourage you to
yeah,
do so, but that wasn't always the case, right?
yeah. But it'd be very interesting to know, like, one, how often people, if they do select a license, if it's the right license for what they're actually trying to do, and if you're just going to a repo, how often you actually open that license, understand what that license means, and then follow the rules of the license, right? Which is
Those are
extreme.
three very different questions.
Yeah,
Those
and
three
we can
things are
talk
all
about
really
it, right?
independent of each other too, right?
Yeah,
Knowing the first one and opening and looking at it and say, oh, this is Apache, okay.
yeah,
Doesn't necessarily mean you know what that means. You've heard,
yeah,
oh, it's Apache. I've heard of Apache. That must be
yeah.
okay. But it's also like, oh, I've heard of GPL. That must be okay.
Yeah,
I've heard
I heard that MIT is like is a really good one, right?
of
Right. I like
a good one.
I've heard that's a
Right?
good one.
We're placing objective value on different kinds of licenses. There's an
Exactly
objective
right.
good and
On
objective
a
bad.
scale from 1 to 10, license.
Right. So yeah, having opened it and said, "Oh, I read the first line, which has MIT license. I know what it is now."
Hmm.
Right. I mean, that's of course, as having seen the talk, I mean, that is one of the major points of what I'm trying to get across to people. Right? Is these things mean something. Licenses are contracts, and that's not to scare people away.
Yeah.
But you do have to know, like, there is a difference between using MIT licensed open source, Apache open source, MPL open source, GPL open source. Like, they do mean
Yeah.
different things,
Yeah.
and have different expectations and obligations. And the last thing you said, right? You said open it. I think you said I want to make people open that file, understand what it means,
Yep.
and follow the expectations and requirements of it. That
Yes.
last one is
Yeah.
like vanishingly small, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
in terms of. And I don't think people are purposely going through and ripping out copyright notices and things like that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, providing the license, and I'll tell you, it's funny. I got a new car last month, and it was
Wait. Pause. What car?
it's a C class. It's a C class cabriolet, and they
Okay.
and they. But here's the thing. They It's a 2019.
Hmm.
So I got it. This dealer shipped me the car. I bought it from out of state, and then they mailed me overnight not only title and all that stuff, but they mailed me the operating manual, the owner
Yeah.
manual.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with the owner's manual, they included a little disc with their open source, free and open source software disclosures on a little mini optical disc.
Interesting.
Fascinating. I actually wanted to post that And I
Yeah.
thought that I was like, people are going to focus on what the car is instead of what,
Yeah.
and I didn't post it.
Like I did
But,
just now, right? Like I have to know what car it is, but like who fucking
right.
cares, right?
Well, no, I mean, it's just, it was interesting
Yeah.
because I've never seen that. It's like, here's all of our open source on a disk. So
Yeah.
probably including the license files, including the repos and all that stuff. Not many companies, I don't think,
I mean,
do
let's
that.
be like, there's some companies that and I'll name a company in a second, but before do I want to kind of explain why I'm going to say it. Like some companies aren't adverse to open source. They just think that does it count as a pull request if you get towed? Sorry. Uh, Brilliant. So there's some companies that are so adverse to using open source, right, for whatever reason, that they'll just build things completely from scratch, right? Like one thing that I thought was very interesting is Tesla, or not Tesla, but SpaceX recently like sent people to the space station, and they built supposedly. I haven't read all through it, but they supposedly built every line of code from scratch. That's what I've heard. I don't know if that's 100% true, and if it is, I mean, wow, like because it's literally like if you looked at the video,
Okay.
like everything is touchscreen. Like it's probably just it's probably just a very sophisticated version of either Linux or Android, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, like
But did they build their own kernel?
that's what I like. I've heard they built their own kernel for the Teslas. I mean,
Oh,
I don't
I didn't know that.
and honestly, I could just be talking a bunch of bullshit to be completely honest, but
Yeah.
you could probably prove me wrong in one Google search. I could probably, and as Jeff Google searches. No, so I think one of the things that's like interesting, like just back to my previous point about people are so adverse to using open source, is that people are scared of, not just people, but entities. So enterprises are terrified of licenses, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, right, if I own some software, I build software as my business, I leverage an open source software like, Newtonsoft, right? Like, JSON.net, right? Literally
Mhm.
the package, if you're a .NET developer, every person uses,
Mhm.
to the effect that if you built .NET Core like a couple versions ago, it came out of the box with it, right? That's since changed. But I guess my point is that they're so adverse to those sort of things that they would rather build things completely from scratch in a less effective way than risk the potential legal liability. And when in some cases the legal liability is just source the owner of the package, nothing else, right?
Right.
In some cases,
Include like, give attribution.
yeah, right. It's
Um, Give attribution and include a copy of the license. I mean, that's obviously, though, that's not always the case, right? I mean,
yeah,
there's more to it. I mean, some things that are even minor things that people don't realize to do, like with Apache license stuff and change logs, like requirements and things like that, which probably oftentimes are forgotten about. I mean, obviously, it's still a lot easier than when you get into some of the dicier stuff around copylefts,
mm-hmm,
around GPL or LGPL,
yep,
GPL 2 versus 3, and can you use this thing? And if it's LGPL, which things become part of the
yep,
open source package, which don't? All that, it gets more complicated.
yep.
But that's the whole point, is that you need to know that, right?
Oh,
Which,
of
going
course,
back to your point from a little bit ago, is I think it's far too often. I mean, on the macro scale, large enterprises are frightened. Absolutely.
yep.
On the micro scale, when you talk about individual developer teams or developers, they don't even think about it.
No,
And so,
because they're not in it for money either,
well,
right?
right.
Like the money
Well,
isn't the biggest thing.
and they're directly in it, well, that's true, but they're also in it from like a tactical, like, I just need to solve this problem. I need to get this thing to work.
Yep.
How do I make this thing work?
Mhm.
Well, I just found an answer.
Yep.
I guess I use this,
Yeah.
which isn't, by the way, isn't wrong. That's why we have open source software. But
Mhm.
it is important to know what the software is being used for. Is it for your own company? Is it for a client? If you're in consulting,
Yep.
this is a big concern in consulting companies,
Oh yes, 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 yes.
right? Where you don't just have to know your own company's policies. You need to understand what is or is not okay for your client. And then, does this particular component have licensing concerns that are problematic
Yeah.
for the ultimate owner and consumer of the software that's being built? And most of the time, the answer is it's just fine, but it's not always, right?
Mhm.
And so it's important that people think about those things. It's a very hard thing to do. I'm actually doing this right now with the company I work for. I work for a shameless plug. I work for a company called Worldwide Technology, which is a global company, but it's based here in St. Louis. And historically, it's a 30-year-old business, but historically it was in network and infrastructure, right? We
Yep.
sold big servers and data centers and switches and all that. Over the last 8 to 10 years, the company has moved into a software and services play. I'm a cloud application architect um, on our cloud services, consulting services team or group. We have people. We have a fairly large now custom software development and application services area, and so we're trying to move towards services. And
Yep.
the company historically has not had really a strong policy around intellectual property and open source. And I don't mean that as a slam against the company. That's true of a lot of larger companies.
Yep.
What is great about WWT, where I work, is they're actually at least thinking about it. I'm kind of part of a small group talking to our own general counsel with leaders from other parts of the company. We're talking about how do we do these things, because the reality is for all of our developers, the people who are doing consulting work for our clients, we need to make sure everyone is better educated and aware so that we can make the right decisions around the components and the tools that our people use and the way that we educate our clients on how to use those things. And it's very difficult because it's easy to get the people at the top to say, yeah, this is great, or it's easy to get directors of development to understand it's important. It's harder to find a way to effectively educate 300 other developers
Yeah.
who
No.
are all just trying to get the job done and who are on individual projects that are all self-organizing. It's very difficult. Um, and so we're working through some of that now, and I think a lot of companies would be well served to try to do the same thing,
Yes.
to try to start at least answering those questions and think about those things. Because enterprise shouldn't be afraid of open source, but should be educated and
Yeah.
should know what the right decisions are for themselves.
Yeah. No, I totally agree on all fronts, right? Like there's no reason to be scared of something. Being educated is far more powerful, right?
Right.
I'm curious about, like, obviously, like, this is something that's very near and dear to your heart, I would say. Do you think that, since, like you said, you're no longer a practicing attorney or a practicing lawyer, does this scratch an itch that you feel like needs to be scratched? Like, knowing, like, being it, not, I'm not saying, like, from, like, a braggadocious perspective, like, oh, I know all this stuff about all these different licensing options, but does it scratch an itch knowing, yeah, I guess you mentioned, like, being able to speak to, like, general counsel and being able to speak with other lawyers about legal terms, right? Like, is it something, like, as a developer, you're still able to do legal work without being a legal person by trade? I'm curious.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe, although I will tell you, I've never really thought about it that way.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, I used to think about it a little bit, although this is probably just more guilt from my parents. There, there's probably a little bit of it of, I took those 3 extra years of school and we spent
Yeah.
all that extra money and went through the
Yeah.
trouble of studying and taking the bar and practicing I practiced in a private firm for 5 or so years after
Hmm.
that before I switched. But keep in mind, I mean, I practiced law as a licensed attorney for about 5 years and I
Hmm.
stopped like 13 years ago.
Yeah.
And so when every once in a while, people will still ask me, so do you miss it? Do you think it was the
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
decision? It's like, I don't really think about it. It was several years
Yeah.
before I stopped thinking of myself as an attorney who decided to also be a developer. I no longer think of myself that way, and I haven't
Oh,
for
for
a long
sure.
time. But what I do think about, not so much scratching the itch, like, oh, I need to do some lawyerly things, because um, the reason I think about it is I guess it's twofold. One is I think that there is value in the sense that, like, I know I can bring something to the table that other people in the industry don't
Sure.
necessarily have.
Yeah.
Um, and that, again, like you said, it's not like a braggadocious thing or like an ego
Mhm.
thing so much as I think this is important.
Yep.
And lots of people would like to get up and talk about it, or lots of people. This isn't just developers, by the way. Humans like to give advice, including legal advice, when
Oh,
they aren't
sure.
qualified
Oh,
to give
sure.
it.
Yeah. I've been on
Um,
the internet long enough to know people love giving me advice.
that's right. And so I think it's important, and I think it would be an opportunity lost and a mistake if I didn't.
Yeah.
Right? Like I think I would be. I think there's an opportunity for me to try to help make a little niche part of our industry that is actually not that small of a niche, and becomes more and more
Yeah.
important with every passing month and year. Um, and so I think I would be doing my colleagues and my friends and the community and therefore myself a disservice if I weren't doing it.
Sure.
And then the other part is like, honestly, like I said, there's the bit of the guilt factor. It's I did take this time to do this thing, and I
Yeah.
should be using it.
Yeah. But it's
But
something you also have interest in, right? Like if you're just doing it just for the hell of it, right? Like that's a
yeah,
whole different thing. But
I mean,
like,
this is not the kind of law I practiced, right?
yeah,
I'm not a patent lawyer or an intellectual property lawyer. Now, granted, keep in mind that for the most part, open source law isn't patent law. There, there are some licenses like Apache and a couple others that do grant a patent license over the things over their covered software.
is it a contractual thing? Like,
It
is
is
it?
contractual. Well,
Yeah.
the licenses are contractual, and
Yeah.
there's different kinds of intellectual property.
Yeah.
There's copyright, there's patent, there's trademark,
Mhm.
and so for the most part, licenses like open source licenses that give you like the MIT license, it's a copyright license.
Yep.
I wrote a thing. It's a work. I mean, I created a thing. My code is a work, just like a book is a work, or just like this painting is a work.
Yep.
And so, as the author of that, I own copyright, and it's protected under copyright law. And an open source license is granting you a copyright license to
Yep.
use the work that I own.
Yep.
And that's not really patent work. That is really more contractual. So, like my background as an attorney was mostly in contract work. I was really a
Okay.
real estate and tax attorney.
Oh, sure.
But I spent a lot of time looking at contracts, negotiating
Hmm.
deals, and things like that. And so, but I always had an interest in, it wasn't like a random thing that said, "Oh, I'll go write software now." I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
really interested in this stuff as a kid,
Hmm.
largely actually thanks to my father's a bit of an entrepreneur, and when I was still in elementary school, for a while as a side gig, he opened a shop building business machines, business
Hmm.
computers
Interesting.
for professionals, accountants, and lawyers, and things like that. I'm air quoting a lot today. I just realized that. It's kind
Oh
of weird.
well.
Um, so he built business machines at a retail shop, and and I got involved helping put those machines together on the weekends and do
Yeah.
stuff I thought was cool. I started my undergraduate program as a computer science, electrical engineering major. I just drifted away from it over time, and then 8 or 10 years later, drifted back to the thing that I always loved anyway.
Yeah.
I've always had an interest in technology, and so meshing the two together from the standpoint of like using my education around the legal side and contractual side of things and my understanding there combined uh, with the software side made sense. And being a software consultant or like a developer of custom
Yeah.
software isn't all that different from being a lawyer, right? Where it's consulting work.
Oh, for
It's just
sure.
different tools of the trade. Instead of using words and contracts and the law to help solve a business problem, we're using code, IDEs, cloud, whatever. We're using technology to solve a business problem.
Hmm.
Consulting with clients to help them understand what their problems are, what the things are they need answered, and helping them find the right answers.
Yeah.
It's the same skill set
I
with
mean,
different tools.
that's pretty spot on. I never really thought about it like that. Like any time that you're working with clients, right? Like it's all in the same, I guess you could say, genre, right? Like there's a legal aspect to it. There's a personal skills. There's obviously some sort of skill, like whether, like you said, it's knowing the law or knowing architecture or whatever. Right? It's
Right.
quite interesting that it's very very similar in all things. So
Yeah.
here's a question that I think is kind of interesting that I just thought of. Right? Are tools partially to blame? Like back to the question about like people actually like looking at the licenses, right? Like, and I'm not blaming GitHub or I'm not blaming other mechanisms to get open source software, but is it the fault or not the fault, but is it because it's not directly there in people's faces immediately? The reason why people don't care about licensing, or is it just that people just don't care about licensing? And I mean like in the small scale, right? They're just trying to get stuff done. Mostly like if they go to Stack Overflow and they just literally like scroll through until they find a check mark, right? Like
Right.
yeah, like what are your thoughts about that, right? Like is it the responsibility of, I guess you could say, entities to kind of, I don't want to say force licensing on people, but force the awareness of licensing on people?
It's an interesting question. The responsibility, the obligation, I think that's a hard thing to say.
Oh, for sure. I'm not saying GitHub is responsible at all for it, right? They're very
Or that they
clear
even
in
have an
that.
obligation to do so. Would it be great that and GitHub has improved over the years, you
Mhm.
know. There was a time, this is probably 10 years ago, when I first was writing the initial iterations of my open source talk a long time ago. And a topic that came up, or a question that came up, is something that I actually experienced in my own work, where it was in Visual Studio,
Mhm.
and a tool, right? One of the, I don't know if it was NuGet or the predecessor NuGet, I don't remember what it was that pulled it in. Um, but I pulled in a package and it showed me the license. It said, here's the thing.
Yeah.
Now you had to click the thing to actually read the license, but it told, right, it
Yeah.
encouraged you, here's what the license is. You check the box and say you agree to the terms and
Yeah.
conditions.
Yeah. Exactly right.
I have a whole humor talk about that actually,
Yeah.
for like a PubConf thing that's about EULAs and like the fiction of people ever actually reading the EULAs and understanding what they say. But
Yeah.
but at least it showed it to you right there when you said, I want to include this and reference this project in my project. But then later, there was an update, a new version of that package I'd already pulled into my
Mhm.
solution, and so I was prompted to
Yeah.
upgrade.
Mhm.
The license had changed. I was
Interesting.
not advised.
Yeah.
Like the tool
Interesting.
didn't tell me that there was new licensing, and so you don't necessarily know. So
Yeah.
like in those circumstances, it would be and now that was fixed a long time ago. But those kinds of things, the trouble with saying that the tooling should take on more of the responsibility is there's almost an implied Good Samaritan law that comes into
Yeah.
effect.
Exactly.
Where it's like, if you're going to take on that obligation, now you have a duty of care to not screw it up.
Yeah. Exactly.
So like
And that's kind of why I was asking it, right? Is it's like it gets into a whole slew of things. And sorry, I interrupted you. Continue.
no, it's fine. But right, it's once you told me, I assumed, oh, that's MIT, that's great,
Yeah.
and I assume that it's all right. And so
Yeah.
now maybe I assume that if it's going to change, you're going to tell me. You told me the first time. Why aren't you telling me when something new happened?
Yeah.
And at the time it didn't. Um, and that is the thing that still happens today. I mean, I don't know. Well, you're on the foundation, so I
Yeah.
don't know if you're paying attention to some of the stuff like around identity server,
hmm
right?
And
Where
I
that,
wanted to get into when things like when open source licensing changes, right? Like that's something that like we could talk for a while about that. Like we've gone through a few in the last couple of months, right? Where in the
right?
.NET community, where there's been a handful of very well-known open source projects who have decided to change their business model a little bit or create a business model on top of their software, which they have every right to do as the owners of that software.
Not only have a
Um,
right to do, but because that even sound. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them doing that, right?
no,
There's a lot of concern. But using identity server as an example, like Brock and Dominic are doing nothing wrong by deciding that they
no,
won't have. I mean, let's face it, they provided great value to the community for a
yeah.
decade. And for them to continue to provide that kind of value, they need to be able to make a living doing it.
Well, that's
And it's
yeah.
very hard to do with open source. And they're trying to look at other models.
And I was having a conversation with somebody about this like a week ago, and I was like anybody who complains about like how dare you say that somebody can't make money off of their work, right? Regardless of where the work of the origin of the work, right? Let's like say for instance you're a painter, right? And you're just some shit painter, right? And then eventually you become very very famous. Does that mean that the paintings you painted when you were a shit painter aren't worth anything? No. You have the right to sell those too. You don't just give them away. But like
Well,
it,
but it's more than that because there are some people who have the feeling like you've always given it away for free. So like you suddenly now it's gotten better and you've decided to ask for money. You shouldn't.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's I just think I think there's inherent flaws in that argument. That's my opinion. But uh, there comes a point when to say, well, you should be doing this is open source. You should be doing it for the love of it. Look, companies have been selling open source for a long time, and so have individuals. And by the way, with the case of some of the more popular projects that have chosen to change their business models and their licensing over time, that they were doing it for the love of it for a very long
hmm
time. The
Yeah.
problem is at a certain point they also have families,
Yeah.
and so they continue to try to support this thing while having other day jobs or try other approaches.
Yeah.
Corporate sponsorship with open source is very difficult to pull
hmm
off.
Yeah.
I mean, it's I mean, honestly, selling open source is very hard too. So I hope they have luck, and I wish them luck, and others who are doing the same thing. Um, I had this conversation with a former client of mine, not from WWT, but from years ago. This is a client who I'm still friends with and keep up with. And we were talking about it just a week or two ago about this specific thing. He said, "What do I do?" I said, "Well, the pricing model is reasonable. And so if it still does for you what it's always done for you, you can probably consider paying for it because you can
Yeah.
afford to.
Hmm.
So like pay for the thing that provides you value. And if it no longer serves your needs or you think there's an alternative that is better or more cost effective, then do that."
Yeah.
But um, yeah,
It's hard.
it's weird. That was sort of, we got on a tangent a bit, but the whole point
No,
was
for sure.
licensing changes in the first place and being prepared for them. But I think the idea of open source as a viable business model is also an important conversation to have because
Yeah. And I've talked with enough people on this thing, this coffee and open source thing. I also do another thing called Project Spotlight for the .NET Foundation, where we talk to maintainers of .NET Foundation projects. And I've
Mhm.
talked to enough people that's like, look, most people do this because they like it. The people that are able to successfully make it into a career where they can pay a mortgage and put their kids through school, like that is a rarity. Like, I've talked to Sean Walker, right? Sean is a great example of that, right? And
Yeah.
like he's even said, like it's very challenging to go down the path of taking something that you built as, oh, like there's a gap in this ecosystem. I'm going to put something into this gap, and then seeing, oh, there's an ability to drive revenue streams, not in a negative way or a sketchy way, but services or add-ons or just things that you can do. And like you mentioned, identity, like that is, it's not like identity server is just like no more open source. Like
Right.
it's literally just, we're doing some open source and we're doing some in a paid model, which,
Depending on your needs as a consumer, you can either have this
yeah,
open source that's more copyleft style, or you can take our commercial license. There's lots of organizations that have always done that.
yeah,
Now, whether or not that's, a lot of the discussion has been around things with the foundation. Does that still fit within the foundation and our organization's mission and model
mhm,
is a potentially a different question, right? But whether or not it's appropriate to have a dual licensing model or to seek commercial benefit from producing open source, I think to me the answer has always been an obvious yes.
yeah,
Now, with that said, something I say to a lot of people. It's kind of a weird way of putting back, but the way I describe selling open source, and you kind of hit on this a second ago, Isaac, is I don't actually think you do sell open source. I believe that what you're doing is you're selling the things that you're putting around and packaging with your open source, and that's
mhm,
the value add. Because
yeah,
the trouble is, if all I'm selling you is open source, there's nothing that stops you from turning around
yep,
the next day. Like by the nature and the requirements of the open source definition and any open source license, you can turn around the next day and give that same open source software away for free or
yep,
for a buck less than I do. And so to effectively sell open source, you aren't really selling the software you've built, which is why it's so important to be able to make the right, to be able to make a living and be able to expand your services and be able to make that something you do full time if you really want to grow your open source project. Because what you really have to be selling are the services, the integration, the support and
mhm.
warranty, anything else. Selling your trademark and brand that goes along with it to know that you're getting the I almost air quoted again, the real
I
deal.
love the air quote. Bring
It's
it air
very
quote.
wasn't there a Friends? There was a Friends episode. A lot. Are you old enough for that? There was a Friends
May
episode
I
where
don't know
he's
if
like,
they.
"I'm sorry." There
Oh
was a
yeah, 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 yeah. That's the one where they do all the hand gestures, right? Like
right,
that, the hand gestures episode. I think the episode's even called the one with the hand gestures. Anyway,
right. Anyway, right. So being successful with it requires that you actually are able to identify the other things that you are leveling up and adding value to with your open source. Because if you're not
yeah,
doing that, then you're just selling an object. You're selling an asset that anyone else can turn around and sell for less.
yeah. Well,
Of
even
literally
so,
the same thing that you just. So it's
yeah. Well, even
um,
think about this, and sorry to interrupt you, but think
no,
about
go
even like a way larger scale, right? Like there are multi-billion-dollar companies that are based on one open source idea. There's one very, very big one that just got bought by this huge enterprise, right? Like I'm talking about Red Hat,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like they were successful in taking an open source idea in building a company that had a multi-billion-dollar evaluation and got bought by IBM for, I don't know, $40 billion, whatever it is, right? And like, sure, they have like a quote unquote paid version of their software, but most of their money, and when I was talking to Hayden Barnes, who works at a company that makes Ubuntu, same sort of thing. It's professional services, it's consulting, it's this, it's that, it's all these other things. And at the end of the day, it's what can you put around the open source for it to actually be a revenue model?
Right. Right. In terms of add-on stuff or enterprise Red Hat Linux and the consulting services available and everything else. Right. They're a great example.
Yeah.
Great example.
Yeah.
Maybe the premier example at this point in our industry. But
yeah. And
yeah.
like, there's a lot of other companies that have done similar things too. Like, you know, we can mention Google or Microsoft, where they proceed to go from a closed source thing to a more open source model of things, right? I'm not saying Google was closed source, but like, there's a lot of things that Google has put completely out in the open that has completely like changed the developer landscape, right? Like they wrote basically a piece of software that now is like the de facto open source standard for like literally everything microservice related, right?
Right.
Like, if you don't know anything about Kubernetes, like, you're missing the point, right?
Well,
According to some folks, at least.
right.
Um,
The Microsoft story is an interesting one too,
yeah.
right? Because it's one thing to take something and grow open source from the ground up, or to take open source and find a business model around it and expand it and everything. It's another thing to do what Microsoft did, which you were just alluding to, which is taking an organization that is pretty closed,
yeah,
and managing not only to change into an open source focused organization. I don't even know if it's fair to say Microsoft's an open source focused organization, but certainly around their developer tools and developer platforms, they are.
Yeah. I mean,
And doing so in a way that not only do you have to actually change your internal practices and internal culture, but now you have to change your brand and your reputation. I mean, Microsoft, I think, is still struggling with that. And we're several years into .NET Core, and we're several years into open source .NET, open source Microsoft tools.
Yeah.
And it's still a battle that a lot of, not only Microsoft, but a lot of us who are, you're actually like an advocate, but even someone like me who just advocates for the .NET community, not being one professionally, have to struggle with that and try to explain to people.
Yeah. I'm not an advocate per se. Just let's be clear. I work in marketing, but I mean, I enjoy advocating for Microsoft. I guess marketing is like the greatest advocation arm ever, regardless of what people say in the, developer relations versus what is sales versus marketing versus whatever. But that's a whole different conversation to have.
Right.
But I think,
but so from a marketing standpoint, though, I think that's an even bigger thing for you then, right? Because if at least on the developer platform side, if you're trying to market that and you're still fighting an uphill battle because people's expectations and already ingrained beliefs about an organization
are for sure
in alignment with what the organization represents today. And part of that is I think also, again, trying to understand what open source even is and what it means.
Yeah.
Right? Because I had this conversation recently around Microsoft's open source repos, and well, it's not just because something's open source doesn't mean that every single person necessarily has a right to contribute and do things, right? And so with .NET open source and Microsoft open source, there's sort of a balance. Individuals are putting in successful PRs and contributing to it, but that's not necessarily what defines open source. It's not necessarily that every single person in the community who wants to is actually adding to the code. It means that you have the right to see it, which means you can't correct things even if you don't actually successfully contribute it back.
Yeah, and that's we can, and I want to try to talk a little bit more about the .NET Foundation, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So just full disclosure, you're on the board of the .NET Foundation. I am on one of the committees of the .NET Foundation, the marketing one. I work at Microsoft. I have to disclose all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason why I don't, like, part of my job isn't doing the marketing committee stuff for the .NET Foundation. I do it because I care about the foundation. I'm a paying member, and I feel that it's one of my obligations to figure out ways that we can better the foundation and make it more inclusive and just a better operating system or whatever you want to call it, entity. And my kid is literally like crawling under my legs right now because
that's totally great.
That's the world that we live in.
As far as I'm concerned, he can be on and join the conversation.
On a
So.
completely unrelated note, I don't know. So I was at that conference about a year, like last summer, right? And so I was doing a talk, funny enough, on working from home, and my family was in the audience, and my kid walked right up to the stage and just
Fantastic.
proceeds to start having a conversation with me. And the great part about it is that it was one of the Pluralsight recorded videos. So it's on Pluralsight forever. My kid having a conversation with me while I'm talking to, 40, 50 people that are in the
Yeah,
room,
that's great.
right? It's pretty good. Like every now and then I'll look at it, not because I like watching my own talks, but because it just reminds me how silly it is.
No stage
Um,
fright.
but yeah, and now my wife is like, "Hey, bring it down here." But yeah, so talking about the foundation, I think is quite interesting, because at least where I sit from the marketing standpoint, it's like, how do we obviously raise awareness of the foundation? How do we do it in an effective way? How do we do it in a way that doesn't seem, I guess, really corny? And how do we resonate with folks, right? And I think one of the issues that I see, if you care about what public opinion is on Twitter, right, is that the .NET Foundation is kind of like, people don't really know what the goals of the foundation are. And I know that there's been some churn over the last year and a half, 2 years of it, and I think that we're kind of getting into a point now where things are stabilizing, or beginning to start the formation of stabilizing.
Yeah.
And I would like to know, as somebody who's been a newly elected board member, I'm not going to go into, why you wanted to be a part of it, because I think that people can figure that out pretty quickly. There's, you talked about it extensively, you were interviewed about it. I think you're pretty vocal about what you think can. But now that you're inside and you're seeing a little bit of how the sausage gets made, like, has that changed your perception on the amount of, I guess you could say, impact that the foundation can do across the greater .NET community?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
So the foundation is evolving.
Yes.
In the grand scheme of things, it's a young organization, a relatively immature organization. It doesn't have the same years of experience and involvement as something like the Apache Foundation and others.
Yeah. Which is always compared to, which is unfair.
Well, I think from the standpoint of mission and objectives, I think it is fair. I think from expecting them to be on equal footing, given the difference in tenure, is less fair. I think that, in addition, not only is the foundation not that old of an organization holistically, it's also changed a lot in the last 2 years. Whereas for a long time, even though it's always been, it was founded and chartered as an independent, not-for-profit.
Yep.
Its ties to Microsoft at the beginning were very firm, and that is changing. And the truth is, I think one of our biggest challenges, and we've been talking about this already this term, is trying to find ways to distinguish ourselves, to make it clear that yes, obviously Microsoft is important to the .NET Foundation, and the .NET Foundation we would like to be important to Microsoft.
Yes.
But .NET is not the same as Microsoft.NET, and .NET is not the same as C#. .NET is certainly not the same as Azure. And there's a vibrant and important .NET community. It's important that people are independent from Microsoft are building .NET tools. It's important that .NET runs on other cloud providers. It's important that there's a lot of things that are separate from Microsoft's marketing goals that someone that you at Microsoft Marketing may have as your day job obligations and expectations.
Yeah. My goal is to get literally every developer in Azure. Like, that's like one of our charters. Not like that's not the actual charter, but it's like that's the goal, right?
To get everybody on Azure?
Yeah.
Yours, right, but not.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like me is in Isaac Levin, the senior product marketing manager in Azure Marketing, right? Which is a completely separate person as Isaac, the person who is on the marketing committee of the .NET Foundation, right? That person's goal is literally just to get people to care about the .NET Foundation from a marketing perspective, right? And ways to do that.
And our goal as a foundation is to get people interested and care about .NET and to use it, and to help grow a healthy and vibrant community around .NET development, especially .NET open source development.
Yep.
But we're trying to work on that, right? Because it's only been in the last couple of years that the board has actually started to be independent, non-Microsoft people.
Yep.
Now, with the elections just a few months ago, this is the first time that we're trying to also evolve into having staggered terms. So 6 of us were elected to the board. But three of those people, unfortunately, me not being one of them, but that was just by drawing straws.
Mm-hmm.
Three of us have 1-year terms, three have 2-year terms, and in the
Yep.
future we're going to have staggered terms,
Yep.
so that we have some continuity of purpose over time instead
Yes.
of every year it's a brand new slate of people and we are all
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure out what's going on. Because transition is difficult when you get an entirely new board. I shouldn't say entirely new because Beth Massey carried over from the last board. She's an
Mm-hmm.
appointed member though, because Microsoft, as the chartering member of the foundation, does get to appoint a single board member.
Yeah.
So Beth, who's part of the marketing board with you, of course, is an appointed member of the board. But beyond that, we're trying to increase the understanding reputation that we are distinct and independent. We would like to see a lot more people who are interested in .NET who are substantially distinct from Microsoft become
Yes.
involved either at senior levels of leading committees and leading initiatives or even running for and becoming part of the board. Of course, the board itself is elected, the members vote, and
Yeah.
so you can only do so much about that as the people who are elected.
Yeah.
But so one thing that's I think the very first step we're working on that is transparency. You said now I get to see a bit about, and maybe we've gotten away from your original question,
No.
but
No.
but now that I've seen a bit about how the sausage gets made, well, one thing that would be great is if more people got to see how the sausage is made
Yep.
without having to have like a special backstage pass.
Sure. That's very true.
Yeah, which there hasn't been enough of historically, and we're trying to improve that.
Mm-hmm.
I've taken over the helm of the outreach committee together with Sean Wildermuth. He and I are kind of coaching it because we have several initiatives, and it is still volunteer work, and so there's only so much you can get done even in 12 months as a lone person. And he and I have some ideas. We're trying to find more people to get involved in outreach. But one of our initial goals is to grow involvement from outside of the traditional, highly represented populations in the community from, say, Western and Northern Europe and the United States. Like there's a lot of that. Well, one of our major goals is to grow membership and grow, even though there's a separate membership committee,
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to grow membership and awareness in other underrepresented communities.
Yeah.
We're having
as we should.
And so we're trying to have conversations with leaders or aspiring leaders in places like in Asia and Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. We're trying to have conversations with communities to grow and have more collaboration, because we think in doing that, we will grow participation, we will grow opportunities to get involved in open source and in .NET development, and start to really distinguish ourselves from being like the Microsoft community.
Yep.
Because of course, like, let's face it, most or all of us on the board, I think, are Microsoft MVPs, and we all have ties in one way or another to. I mean, Bill Wagner's not, because he's an employee, but all of us in some way or another have those connections.
Yep.
But the majority of us care about being distinct.
And this is kind of where my rant starts. So please, if I start to rant, cut me off.
No, let me give you a soapbox.
Yeah. Well, I always this entire Coffee and Source is just basically a conduit for me ranting. But no. So like I have very strong opinions of the .NET Foundation, and I'm just going to start talking about them. One, and this is going to be very tongue-in-cheek, coming from the fact that both you and I are of a similar demographic, almost exact same demographic. Mm-hmm. Like there are two.
I'm a Cardinals fan. We already talked about that.
Well, yeah. Well, if that's the case, I don't even like baseball at all. I just like stabbing myself in the leg.
All right, go on.
Yeah, but so there's a lot of middle-aged white guys in this space, right? And it's nobody's fault, right? That people of a certain ilk have gravitated to being more interested in the foundation. I think now the foundation has an obligation, and this is my opinion, to change that by empowering different areas of the community to be more open. And one of the things that I like to bring up is that also the .NET Foundation membership, right? It's for the most, it's like 450, maybe 500 people,
membership,
right?
No, about 800.
Oh, is it 800? Regardless, I think it could be much bigger.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, internally at Microsoft, I think it's not even internally. I think Scott Hunter's even talked about it. There's like 1 million plus, .NET applications that are publicly available, right? Or even more, right? Mm-hmm. So, you think about it, like how many .NET developers really are there? And Sure, I understand why the membership number is low. One, there's a dues. We can talk about the dues if you want, but like there's a dues, right?
Mhm.
Even though it can be waived. Um,
Mhm.
there's also a visibility thing where people just don't care. They're developers by day and they don't give a ish by night. Um, but I also like there's just I don't know what the best approach is, and I think I'm curious from somebody who's in outreach, like how do you go about like you talked about getting different like trying to be more active in different areas of the world, but there's a ton of people in northwestern Europe and the United States that are not part of the foundation that could be. And I just want to know what your general thoughts about trying to bring those folks in.
Um, yeah. So, God, there's a lot there to unpack.
Yeah, no. I'm sorry. This is the soapbox
Um,
issue, right? Like I need
yeah,
like
that's just put in the chat. We're talking about the membership fee, which is which is a fair point because it's not. It's easy to say it's not expensive, but it's easy for me to say that being, like a established
oh
middle-aged
for sure.
white collar guy.
Yeah, I mean, and also it's
Um,
like you can go and spend $100 and take your like if you can afford it. I'm saying like what are the things that you could do with that money instead? You can go on a date with your significant other and have a nice night, or you
there's
can spend $100.
right, especially because it's sort of what does the foundation really do for like why am I what am I
Yes.
paying for? What am I supporting? So yeah, we absolutely, we've been churning a bit on mission and vision statements and stuff, which I
Hmm.
think has some value. But I think we do need to do a lot more to highlight what it is the foundation could do and also what it doesn't do, right?
Yes.
What the objectives are. I mean, a big part of the foundation historically, although it is and can and should be so much more, is that we take ownership of these projects, right? But it doesn't mean there's a lot of confusion there. Oh, good. So how can you guys add this feature? No, we're not the maintainers. We aren't,
Yes.
our small organization isn't suddenly maintaining 100 different .NET
Yeah.
ways. What we're doing is because there are a lot of repos that are maintained by one or a small
Hmm.
handful of people who are individuals who are doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, we're providing continuity planning and
Yeah.
legal protection and some of the other stuff that maybe the individual developer doesn't know that much about and isn't as capable of providing for themselves. And we're trying to make sure that those things are in place and we help with that.
And services, right? Like
Right,
like providing legal services to projects is extremely
right.
valuable. Providing infrastructure services like code signing is very very valuable, right?
That's
Like
right. That's right.
there are some things that I had a conversation with Mitchell Sellers, who's one of the maintainers for DNN, which is formerly .NET Nuke, and he's like,
Mhm.
without the foundation, we'd be in a rough spot, right? Like, there's a lot of things
Yeah,
that like we just can't like we can't do some of these things, right? And
right.
it's
It's,
extremely important.
yeah, and some of those things are expensive. I mean, to the point of the membership fee, which is a complicated question, but like
Yeah.
the thing with the membership, one of the issues is simply um, the amount of our budget that just goes to legal services alone is um, can be eye-opening for people because we are providing those services, making sure that the right things are in place for all the member projects, right?
Hmm.
And so there has to be a way to support those things, and
Yeah.
but anyway, reaching people. One thing I think is really interesting, and the outreach is tied to this, but um, something that ties back to even COVID. I mean, 2020 has been pretty horrible. Let's be clear.
And
2020 has been
ha-
really, really, really bad.
hashtag
Um,
what's that called? Hot take. It's a
yeah,
hot take, right?
my
It's a
hot
hot
take,
take that
2020
literally
has
the world is
been
on fire, right? Anyway.
really bad. There have been periods of time when the world has actually been on
Yeah,
fire in
yeah, yeah, yeah.
2020, and that doesn't even crack the top 20 of things that have been horrible in 2020. But um, one interesting side effect is that even though I personally, and this is probably an unpopular opinion, I kind of hate virtual events. Um,
Somebody that actually helped put one together.
but right, that's right.
Yeah,
I find them very hard to do well, and I find it very hard for me personally to feel super engaged. I
yeah,
enjoy the speaking part, but I find it hard to be engaged as like someone who's really there and present at the event when it's all
yes.
virtual. However, it has the fact that everyone has become accustomed to the idea that, at least for the time being, things are virtual,
Yeah.
it has opened the door to communities and leaders in places that otherwise wouldn't have the capital or the draw to be able to
Yes.
bring in speakers or to send their own community speakers to events to participate in things elsewhere.
Yep.
It makes it much more possible. Back to the outreach thing, some of the stuff, had a great conversation earlier this week with Michael Dara from Zimbabwe. And he's looking to grow he said, there's some good GDG stuff going on in Zimbabwe. There's some good stuff in other communities. He's looking to grow. He's got some great ideas. He's super excited and passionate and has some really good ideas around growing a .NET community in Zimbabwe. Or Franco Doom, who in Ghana is he's an MVP and he's become a bit of a friend of mine, I guess, over Twitter anyway.
Yep.
He's been able to draw speakers, and we've been talking about ways to take his own leaders and talented educators and export them, so to speak, virtually to other events. And because of the fact that everything is virtual, it is a lot easier for me even just attend. Say, I'm going to go and check out this thing and support this community in Chile. Why not?
Yeah, and somebody, and I'll just mention this, like from a Microsoft perspective, right? Like, people, before COVID, if you wanted to go to Build or Ignite, it was a substantial amount of money.
Right.
Like, talking about the entrance fee to the event is thousands of dollars, and then the flights and the hotels and that it's expensive for an individual or a business to sponsor. Now it's all free and online.
Yeah.
Like, just think about that from an inclusivity standpoint. And I'm not trying to like pump up Microsoft. I'm just saying, like, it's just one of those things, right? Where
Microsoft's not the only organization that's done it.
That's very true.
But you're exactly right. And it's not even the large events. I mean, Ignite and Build or reInvent and all these different things, like that's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
But like NDC, for instance, right? Like NDC online, right? Like NDC is a very well-known multi-city like set of events, and now they have online iterations, multi-continent, right? Exactly. Yeah. Like, it's like the logistics on that was probably very interesting, and now the logistics are interesting in different ways, because like, how do you, like, instead of trying to get people to your location, how do you get people to your website? How do you get people want to stay and watch sessions for multiple times, right? Because if you go to an event, people are trapped, right? Like, they either go back to their hotel, sit in a hallway and chat, or they can go to a session. You have far more options of distractions when you're in front of a computer in a virtual event, right? So,
yeah, I mean, here's some pros and cons, right? Like, if we wanted to sort of weigh them and think about these things, because on the one hand, totally great for diversity, and of course, diversity is an interesting word, right? Because there's D&I everywhere in large organizations now, but the trouble with a word like diversity is it's a really nice word to use, because you can use it and know that the recipient of your language is going to use that word to mean whatever they want it to mean in the moment. But I'm speaking more about, say, geodiversity, ethnic diversity, economic diversity. Absolutely, it is improved with virtual events and opportunities. There's no question that people are able to go to things like Ignite, like you're talking about, and all that, where maybe they couldn't before. And even more importantly, I think can attract attention to their own communities by participating. It is much harder for a speaker to come in person to Kansas City to speak at KCDC if they live in Senegal.
Yeah.
Than it is for them to participate virtually in NDC Sydney from their home in Senegal.
Oh, right? I mean,
and that's not just about that individual, by the way, getting the opportunity to be seen. The reason that I've been pushing, and others in the foundation, like Sean and others, have been pushing for that level of outreach and engagement, is because, there's only so much I can do or you can do as the middle-aged white guys in the United States to help other organizations, which other communities, which frankly are doing just fine. Like, they have talented, smart people who are really doing great things. They could just potentially do more if there was more awareness of the things that they are doing. And so by taking someone who is awesome already and exposing them to the world and saying, instead of only being able to speak in a local meetup here, now they're being seen by people everywhere, that draws attention back to their own local communities, and it makes people realize, oh, there's some really great things happening in those communities, and now more attention is poured back into those communities that wasn't there before. I think that's a great thing of virtual. What we lose, and the reason why I struggle with them is because I we're at 12. I don't know if you want to like just
I'm
cut it
still
off after
talking. I mean,
5
like,
after. I'll just
again,
keep talking, but
yeah, yeah, like, again, I kind of gave you a time frame just to level set with you. Like, but again, I don't have a hard stop. I think this conversation is going great. It's completely
great.
up
Well,
to
we'll
you.
keep chatting
Yeah.
then, at least for a few. I have to go register my car today because I'm at the deadline for registering my car.
Uh-oh.
But I got a little time. So one thing that is lost and why it's very hard for me is because I think that the content is really valuable, but not the most valuable thing that happens. And
Yeah.
I think that real collaboration, even with the virtual thing, awesome that we can bring somebody from a more remote part of the world who doesn't necessarily get to come to the United States easily to participate in American events or European events, Australian events, and be there and be seen. But the best value is to then be heard and grow relationships and actually meet people.
Hmm.
And that I've yet to find a very effective event. I'm sure it's gotten better. I've actually sort of been focusing my efforts on foundation stuff, and I haven't been as involved in the events the last few months. But
Yeah.
in the early parts of the pandemic, I found it very difficult to connect.
Oh yeah, no, like it's very hard to connect. Period. Right? It's funny because everybody is looking at people all day long. Right? Like we
Right.
all have this video, but like there's like it's substantially different looking at somebody through a screen or face to face, right? And like your point about like network chat or network chats, hallway chats, and networking at events, like the only reason why I am in this position right now and doing all any of the things that I'm doing is because of a hallway chat. Like I don't. I've told this story probably before. If you haven't heard it, whatever. Like I used to work with Scott Addy years ago, like 10 years ago. We used to work at the same insurance company. I was at Build because my company sent me there, and I had a conversation with him, and he was talking about this is before he joined Microsoft, and we were talking about stuff, and he was talking about how he was contributing to Docs, and he was building Visual Studio extensions, and he was getting to work with people in Microsoft, and how great it was, and he was contemplating joining, and like at that point, like something a light bulb just went off in my head, and I'm like, I've literally been a developer for so long, and I've just used all of those other people's hard work without any thanks or any giving back. And I think it's time to start giving back. And that's when I started doing blogging and writing docs and open source projects and actually caring about what I'm doing. And
It's
that
very rewarding.
led me to Microsoft, and now I'm here talking to friends that I met at events. Right?
Right.
It's like that's the thing. Like
It's a
that.
very rewarding thing to be able to do,
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, because whether it's through the period you spend on stage or on camera giving a session, teaching something to somebody and making them feel more effective and more empowered in their day job to go out there and do something, or the relationships that you build during those hallway conversations where maybe I mentor an awful lot of event organizers, an awful lot of speakers, because it's like these are people who, have looked for the longest time and said, man, I wish I could do that. So, well, of course you can do that. You know stuff.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the ways that you can develop those skills
Mhm.
and feel more fulfilled about the thing that would make you happy and make you enjoy your profession and your life. And you get an opportunity to do that in a way that like it's really nice to make a company more successful
Yeah.
who pays you, and that's great, and that's important too because business matters and but it's not the same warm fuzzies and feel good as when you know that you can see the actual individuals whose lives you're
Oh yeah.
touching, and to know the butterfly effect of what happens, right? Or the
Mhm.
trickle down's a funny choice of words, but
Yeah.
the effect that you have of knowing that you help this half dozen people, and each one of them goes and helps, and before you know it, the impact that you're having on a whole lot of individuals can be tremendous, which is it's very very rewarding.
Yeah.
Um, but some of that is gone. I mean, like CodePalooza that Chad Green puts on in Louisville. The tools he used, now I don't remember what they're called. The tools he used for CodePalooza this year, I thought were pretty good. That was the
Mhm.
closest I got to something where I felt like, okay, well, there's some real interaction here.
Yeah.
Um, but the hardest thing isn't even just that the tooling has to mature. It's something else you said a few minutes ago, which is more distractions, right? It is, and it's not just me becoming distracted or you becoming distracted. It's if a typical developer, whether they're participating as an attendee or as a speaker,
Mhm.
wants to be part of an event,
Mhm.
and you go to Kansas City, or you go to San Francisco, or you go to London, or you go to wherever, to Louisville, and you participate in an event, there's an understanding not only of you and like the whole, well, I can go sit in my hotel room or be out with people, but there's also an understanding to a certain extent of like that individual's employer. There's an investment being made by the employer. We're not only
Yes.
paying for the ticket for this person to go, but we understand that we're sending them for their professional development holistically,
And to bring things back, right?
and to bring those things back both in the form of knowledge learned from sessions and relationships formed from talking to people.
Mhm.
When instead that's a virtual thing, even when you're participating as a speaker in the event, it is much easier for an employer without even feeling like they're doing anything wrong. It's much easier for an employer to be like, yeah, no, we know you're doing that thing. So like we've got it marked down on your calendar that like is blocked from 11 to 12 on Tuesday. So go give your talk, and then we've got a meeting at 12:15.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And it's like, well, but there's so much more to the event than that one session that you're going to. And but it's like, well, you're not in an event. Come on, you're getting on it like you're doing a podcast for an hour, and then you come back
Yeah,
like, no,
exactly.
this is
That's
a 3 day
yeah.
long professional development event where I'm trying to engage with the community and make other people better and make myself better and bring that back and make our organization better. And that gets lost very quickly when events are virtual.
Mhm.
Um, because it's sort of like, all right, yeah, let me know which couple things you're going to go to, especially because so many of these events are free. But actually, like paying for something does create a perception of value, right? I had this
And
conversation years ago before I
yeah,
was involved with the KCDC board when Boone Lee and John Mills and Lee Brandt were looking at KCDC and taking it from being a free event, like a free code camp event in its
yep,
first couple of years to being a pay event. I said, you're going to find less attrition. You're going to have less people drop off on the second day and not have as much wasted food and all those things because people are going to pay even if it's a small amount.
yeah,
And they've invested something, there's obviously value there.
yeah.
And and an organization that pays for a ticket to send and pays to send someone to an event knows they've invested in that thing. Whereas if it's just that, oh, I can go to this thing for free, is that cool? Yeah, sure. Pick a talk you want to go watch and then come on back to work.
To do full circle, right? Like one thing you brought up was very interesting. You talked about, you know, putting money
I'm
in.
sorry, I'm disappearing from camera for a moment because if I don't plug my laptop in,
Oh,
I'm going to be gone very soon.
as long as you can hear me.
I can hear
Um,
you.
so, full circle, right? Like you mentioned, there, like if you put your own money in, there's a value there, right? Like there's an expected value. We were just having a conversation about the .NET Foundation dues, right?
Oh, right.
Like, and it's very interesting because it's very true, right? Like as somebody who put the $100 in, like where's my value? Like what do I get? Um, and it's very interesting, that conversation, because I've had this talk with people a lot where it's like, it, as a member of the foundation, like, or as not a member of the foundation, you can still like be a part of the foundation. You can give back, you can do these things. And like since the foundation, at least this is just my visibility of it, it's a free thing, right? Like all the stuff that we do out is out in the open. .net is out in the open. Like you don't,
Mhm.
and unless you specifically get something for your dues other than like a badge saying that you're a member, like what's the difference, right? And that, I think that's an interesting conversation, right? Where it's not even just with the foundation, but things in general, right? Like we go back to even licensing software. Like when things are out in the open, what's the value for putting money into it, right?
It, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
It's that's very difficult,
yeah.
right? Because you are getting real value by putting money into it. So we're
Yeah.
talking, I hope I'm not talking out of school by saying this.
I mean,
There's
nobody
a
watches this anyway, so you can say whatever
perfect, yeah.
you want.
Um, there's another new committee or reorganized committee that Rodney Littles is helping run around corporate sponsorship and things. And one thing we're looking at is actually not only the big dollar sponsors, which we have a handful of, but looking at other possibilities for smaller business to become corporate members.
Yeah.
Right? We don't currently have a corporate membership drive around the foundation, and it's not in place yet, but we're talking about it, and I think it's something we'll move forward with. Um, but both whether we have that and corporate members or individuals, you are getting something just just for the legal and continuity backing alone of these things, because these things that we do take for granted of like, oh well, there's all this free and open source software that also happens to be free of cost.
Yeah.
And remember, free isn't free information, not free isn't free beer.
Yes.
Right? Open source doesn't mean free of cost, but very much of the open source we use is free from cost, and we take that for granted. But the reason that's possible is because some of the backing that organizations like the Foundation offer.
Yep.
And if we aren't there to provide those services and provide that legal support and make sure that there's continuity of these things, make sure that if there's need for hosting and that sort of stuff, then a lot of these tools that we do take for granted that we use in our everyday lives go away.
Yeah.
Now the hard thing is for many developers, as you rightly said earlier, many developers, they care and they like their job, so they're developers by day. There's lots of developers who are passionate and do things at night. But there's plenty of others who don't. Like, they care about their job, they like their job, they like software. Like, that's what they do for a living. And they go to work and they do this thing, and so they know they're benefiting from this. But, like, if those libraries go away, does it harm them as individuals? Not really, or at least if so, that's yet that's another thing removed. Like, well, it's harder for me to do my job, which makes it harder for things at work because work's having a harder time because they don't have access to these free tools and all that. But that is a very tenuous connection. So I mean, right, a lot of what we're going to be doing over the next 6-12 months is we're talking about, and I don't know, I don't know how successful we'll be in this initiative, but we are trying to figure out ways to express that better, make sure that's understood better. There's a chicken and egg problem because you got to be able to reach the audience first to make sure the audience understands and knows why it's valuable. It's something we're working on, but it's hard.
Yeah, and I think my pushback comment is it took you like 2.5 minutes just now to explain what the value prop is for putting money into it, right?
Right.
Like,
I also tend to speak that way anyway.
No. I'm saying that every word you said was needed. You didn't stray. My point is that it's hard, right? Like, if I'm somebody who it's like, okay, $100, what's my value prop? Listening to Jeff Strauss talk for 2.5 minutes, they're not gonna, if they're not fully into it, they're just gonna stop and move on, right?
Right.
That's kind of my point. And I've had a lot of these conversations with people, and it's just, if you can't eloquently, quickly explain the value prop for anything, not even talking about the Foundation, but anything really, people tend to tune out, right? And when you're talking about new membership, you don't want people to tune out. You want them to be, oh, that makes a ton of sense. Click the button. Otherwise, they'll move on.
Right,
and take full advantage.
I think there are easy elevator pitches. Sorry for that, to make for the Foundation about why it's valuable, but the value prop to the individual member is hard.
Oh yeah, to projects it's very easy
to make. The value for why an individual member should do it is tougher. No question. We're working on it. Is all I can really say, right? We know it's hard and we know it's a problem. And we're looking at it.
And I think,
and by the way, sorry, but by the way, for for the 6 people who watch this, hopefully more over time. You post this to YouTube afterwards, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. What I just noticed, by the way, like literally just now, even though I've had the Twitch stream open in a different window, is that underneath our video it still says Coffee and Open Source interview Cam Soper.
Does it really? Oh, because the previous video is probably underneath it, yeah. Oh,
maybe because that's when I loaded it or something, yeah. And anyway, so
now I'm very curious. Keep talking.
I interrupted myself and I lost my own train of thought completely. What was I going to tell you?
We were talking about value props of the Foundation, and the work that we're doing to try to basically, I don't want to say convince people that being a member is a good idea, but showcasing the value and what you are giving back to the community by being a member.
I would love to reach the point where we could rely on corporate members and corporate sponsors to basically be able to say, you know what, like, just join. Like, don't pay, just join and be a part of the community. Because I think there is value being part of a community. You're right that a lot of the stuff is open source, right? And so a lot of the repos, most of it, right? I mean, the repos themselves, that's the whole point. And so do you have to be a member to go look at those things? No. It's more the opportunity to participate in things like the outreach stuff, if that's something that scratches a niche and people care about, right? Being a member of these committees and having a direct impact. We aren't the developers of the open source ecosystem, but we do have influence. Like, the Foundation and its leadership has influence, and people who choose to become heavily engaged and involved in it, that is a way to exert influence, right? It's one thing to drop an issue or make a comment on a GitHub repo. It's another thing we want people to be involved. Like that's what
Yes.
we want. And so join and become an active member of the outreach committee, join and become an active member of the projects committee or the membership
Yeah.
committee or the sponsorship committee. Do those things. And one of the values of being a member is that you get to do that, which again, in a time when it's harder and harder to have in-person events, you get an opportunity for real interaction, right? We have regular meetings, talk to people, and it's one thing to drop a thing on GitHub. It's another thing to have meetings like this all the time and actually
Yeah.
interact. You grow relationships, and you can actually, as a member of the foundation, as a member of these committees, actually make a difference.
Mhm.
If something you think is bad, like we want those ideas, we want to hear. If there's a way that, oh, now I'm back to where I was when I interrupted myself. If you know, it's one thing for me to say it's easy to make an elevator pitch to the foundation, but not for these other bits. We we want ideas.
Mhm.
One of circling way back something said earlier on the call here is we want more people to be able to see how the sausage gets made. We want there to be more transparency and more involvement. You don't have to be an elected board member to be
Mhm.
involved and do things and to make a difference. We want to hear. We aren't an ivory tower, like at all.
Yeah.
And as I said on the all hands call a couple weeks ago, most of us on the board have open DMs.
Mhm.
Uh, at least I believe that's true. I know I do, and 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 we want to hear from anyone who has ideas. If there's a way we can make things better, now some of it is harder than others, right? Some of our job now is to educate, say, oh, that's a really great idea. Let us explain to you why that's challenging. But then, great, let's collaborate and say, well, understanding those challenges, how do we fix that? Um,
It's, I mean, a lot, and to be completely honest, like a lot of it sounds like sure, no brainer, makes sense, but it's still trying to convince the guy or gal or anybody who wants anybody else what why does it matter to me, right?
right.
Like, and this is just me, like, if you were to do a poll of the people that are in the foundation as members, I would imagine a very large majority of them are already Microsoft MVPs. And the reason why I say that, I think, or Microsoft employees. And the reason why I say that is because those are the folks that, at least from my observation, we're already doing kind of those sort of things in the .NET community with outside the foundation. Whether that be building open source repositories or writing docs or blogging or sponsoring or holding on events or working for partners that take full advantage of .NET. They build tools around .NET. And I'd be very interested to see like how many people did not already have like a very close proximity to the Microsoft MVP program or Microsoft in general. I'd be very curious to
I
see
will
that.
say this. Um, when the elections were open,
Mm-hmm.
I was surprised by where I saw the most chatter around candidates
Mm-hmm.
and voting in the elections. The majority of names I saw come across on the feed talking about the .NET Foundation elections were not names that I knew, were not people I knew, and many of them were from places that were in some of these what we've been referring to as underrepresented communities. I mean, I'm not going to say a majority, but a lot more
Sure.
than I expected. A lot of the vocal members now they may be people who are very well established in open source development or open source projects and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
but a very large number of the people who were the vocal ones talking about it
Mm-hmm.
were not the people who I'm used to from the MVP program. Now, granted, there's a lot of MVPs and a lot of people in the community who are not in the speaker part and events
Right.
part of the community, which is really kind of my home.
Yeah.
Um, but it was a lot of new faces and new names to me. Now, what I do agree with is that not many people are joining the foundation to learn about opportunities to become engaged in .NET, right? People aren't joining the foundation and say, oh, I'm interested in learning about .NET, so I'm going to join the .NET Foundation and find
Yeah.
resources and figure out how I learn it because I'm not a .NET developer today and I'm interested in finding out if that's right for me and other opportunities for me to grow my career as a .NET developer by being
Yes.
part of the foundation.
Yes.
I agree that that is an untapped potential that is not happening,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's more the existing .NET developer community, which, as you rightly stated, is millions of people. 800 of whom are members today, right? are people who are developers already in the .NET ecosystem who are saying, oh, maybe I'll join the foundation and see how this works. And I think that's valuable as well. But I would love to see the foundation be an opportunity and a place for people to learn more. That was, I mentioned Michael Dara earlier. That's the guy in Zimbabwe who wants to start a thing. One of his goals, he said to me when we had our conversation earlier this week, as Monday morning we were talking, my Monday morning, and he said, look, there are these strong communities, but it's because there just aren't that many people who are .NET developers, and there's not that much of a .NET ecosystem here in Zimbabwe, but I think there's opportunity for there to be one. There are talented people who could gain a lot by also developing those skills and open up job opportunities and career opportunities for themselves by getting involved in that part of our industry and building a community around it. And those developers don't know about the foundation. They don't even know it exists. So I think that's a place we could grow for
Yeah.
sure.
And I totally agree. I think one of the things that the foundation could be very successful at is, and I think we're starting to do it, right? The openness. I mentioned a little bit about the fact that all hands and everything's on GitHub. And Layla talked. I think she was on .NET Rocks a week ago or whatever. She talked about building discords and building other mechanisms to communicate other than just Twitter, which is Twitter. Um, but I think like just keeping the lines of communication as open as possible always it is really really important. But it goes back to my previous thought is like, okay, so what do people who put money into it get if everything's already out in the open? But that's a different conversation for a different day, I think. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a much longer conversation than we are going to solve that problem right now.
yeah,
I absolutely agree that more opportunities. Layla's push for Discord actually largely came out of the idea that so much is done right now on GitHub,
yeah.
right? I mean, for internal foundation stuff, we have a Teams org and all that, right?
Mhm.
But we don't use that for public communication because, you know,
Yeah,
uh,
Teams, because
right?
Teams is challenging sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say that to the Microsoft employee on the
I
other end.
mean, look, I love Teams. I also despise Teams.
Right. So, but I mean, GitHub, if you're not already actively engaged in the open source community as an open source contributor and dev, you probably aren't going to find the foundation on GitHub. Um, so we need to find developers where they are and create other opportunities. We've talked about whether we should use Slack. We've talked about Discord. We're going to do some of those things and try them out. I mean, there's no real harm,
Yeah.
and see where people engage with us. Encourage people to participate in certain of these things without being members up to a point, right? Because how else do you find out about this stuff? We're going to be doing some panels and I think some conversations in various communities where people can, like AMAs, with the board and with committee leaders and things from the foundation to say that, let's talk to us about it. What would you like to see this foundation do? What would make it more meaningful to you, and how can we help? It's just a process, right? It's just going back to what I said at the very beginning of this conversation. The foundation is young and immature and evolving, but we want to mature and evolve. So, and we'll get there. It just takes time and takes people who are motivated and excited and have ideas and who are willing to share those ideas, and people who want to contribute and be a part of that.
Yeah, and I think just the fact that you wanted to chat with me about the .NET Foundation. Anybody who wants to chat with me about the foundation is welcome to. The fact that board members are out and talking about the foundation is awesome. The fact
Mhm.
that we did the all hands, the fact that Claire is out there talking about stuff as well, I think it's super valuable. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really important about the foundation itself is that we continue to drive open source, right? Like this whole concept of open source to me is very important, hence why I'm doing this silly thing.
Right.
But I think the the end of the day, like without open source, like .NET needs open source, the open source community to help champion it. Like .NET is always going to be a thing. Microsoft's always going to be heavily involved in it, but unless developers adopt .NET, the new iterations of .NET, like it kind of just slowly dies in the vine, which nobody wants.
Right.
So
Right.
we've been
And it's
talking
actually
for a
growing,
while.
right? Adoption is growing.
Yeah,
And
of course. I mean,
so it's not like it's withering. It's just we want to expand the universe of individuals who participate in the community and in our ecosystem to make it better.
yeah,
Um, diversity of ideas, diversity of thought.
yeah, totally
Uh,
agree.
yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we've been chatting with the people for long enough. I really appreciate Jeff. I really appreciate your time coming on here. Um, when we close out our conversations, I like to ask this one question to my guests, which is, I guess, the only real question, right?
Okay.
If you could describe open source in one word, what word would that be?
Oh man. Um, God, the first word that comes to mind is community, but of course that's so trite.
Which is very offensive to all the other people who have said community,
Exactly. But that's just it.
which is a lot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that I don't know the right one single word for it.
Oh, you can,
If
just
I'm
don't talk
looking
for
for if
two
there's a
minutes, right?
single, I'm looking for the single word that represents the idea of rising tides.
I mean, rising tides doesn't have a hyphen in it. No,
No, it's two
no,
words. I'm going to use it anyway.
with a hyphen.
Yeah, we're going to make it a compound now. You know what? If we're Dutch or German, I'm confident that the word would be a single word.
Probably, or or especially like if it was Chinese or Japanese, it would definitely be one symbol.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I'm going to go with that. I'm going to say right
rising tides.
because that's right. I'm looking to embody the idea that by being a community and collaborating, we actually make we all make each other better and make the industry better and make the community better. Yeah,
I
that
think it's pretty spot on because as the stereotype fits, like most attorneys are wordsmiths, so you had to go the route of rising tides. I think that's pretty brilliant if you think about it. But anyway, so thank you so much, Jeff, for coming
thank
on.
you.
This was a great conversation. I hope people enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it. And for everybody out there, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and take care. Bye bye.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.